This discussion will be moderated by Mr. Chico Tillmon. He's award-winning executive director of the Youth Safety and Violence Prevention Program here at the YMCA in Chicago. He's also a veteran of the United States Air Force or in the Air National Guard. He is also a PhD candidate. So again, we have someone in a very similar piece that is focused in on service, scholarship, and an important impact. He'll be joined by a number of Tillman scholars. They'll come out here in just a moment, and they'll also have a chance to introduce themselves, but I think it's important to sort of note the impact areas that each of these scholars have on. We have Scott Swisher, doctorate in education, yet focusing on this particular issue. We have 2019 scholar Eric Chastain, a social work focus in terms of an impact area, yet something that can apply to this particular problem. Jennifer Esparza, law student, going into her third year of her JD program, and then also Tillman scholar Patrick Robinson, MBA, former lawyer himself, but now working in the nonprofit sphere with the Chan Zuckerberg organization, again, trying to deal with this problem. And I think having those different perspectives, and again, as they come out here on the stage in just a moment, having those different perspectives is a very, very important thing to consider. But as we get started with that, let's give our moderator and a panelist a warm, warm welcome.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'm honored to be in this sacred space, to be able to dialogue with each and every one of you. And more importantly, I thank everyone for their service and for their scholarship, for lending the talents that you have to protect our country, but also to use your mind to elevate our way of thinking, the way we think about things, not only in the criminal justice system, but in all aspects of life. So I thank you. I would like to start off by giving you a tidbit, a little bit about myself, and then I'll allow each and every one of the panelists to do a brief introduction. As JD so eloquently said, my name is Chico Tillmon. I'm a native of Chicago, and I have a triadic perspective when looking at the criminal justice system. I'm someone who was criminally impacted by the criminal justice system, but also I'm a practitioner and I'm an academic. So I have three different lenses in which I kind of look at the criminal justice system, someone who has been impacted, but also someone who is trying to make change. As a practitioner, I work with a particular program called Urban Warriors, where we utilize post-9/11 veterans and the skills that they have in combat as an asset to help youth in our most marginalized and vulnerable communities. Right now, I'd like to allow the panelists to introduce themselves real quickly, and then we'll start with the questions. We'll start with Jennifer.
I'm Jennifer Esparza. I am entering my third year of law school at Georgetown, and I've been focusing on international law, criminal defense, human rights, and have been working for the last year and a half on a capital punishment case on the defense side for a Guantanamo detainee. I am going this year into a criminal defense clinic, so I'm very excited to be on this panel with you all.
Awesome. My name is Patrick Robinson. I was an Army JAG for just short of 9 years before I left active duty. I went to an MBA program at Stanford, thinking about the intersection of entrepreneurship, technology, and the criminal justice system. I've been focused on some work actually related to a tech startup, and then I stumbled into this amazing role at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. It's a philanthropy founded by Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg. They've committed to giving away 99% of their wealth in their lifetimes, and one of their focus areas is in criminal justice reform. Specifically, what I'm looking at with them is how we can use data science to better inform prosecutorial decision-making to take into account the full spectrum of outcomes from a criminal charging decision. So thinking about whenever a charge is applied to a particular case, whether that will have the best pro-social outcomes for that individual person in the community going forward. It's a very hard data problem, but I'm thrilled that I get a chance to work on it.
Hi, I'm Tom Baker. I was in the Army. I was a police officer in Phoenix for about 9 years. Currently, I'm a PhD student at the University of Missouri in St. Louis in the criminology department. My area of focus is policing, police culture, police use of violence. Currently, I'm working on a DOJ grant to reduce violence in North St. Louis, and a second grant to create a comprehensive database of people killed by the police in the United States. And thank you for having me today.
Excellent. I'm Scott Swisher. I'm the Assistant Director for the Moreau College Initiative, which is a partnership between the University of Notre Dame and Holy Cross College to provide currently incarcerated men associate degrees and bachelor's degrees.
My name is Eric Chastain. I'm starting my doctorate in social work next month. I'm still in the active duty Army now. For those of you who've gone to parade rest because I'm a sergeant major, please stop. All right, so it's just kind of weird. But the reason this is important to me, I'm focusing on decarceration, smart decarceration, a way to reduce some of the prison population. It affected me personally and professionally. Growing up in Southern California during the 3 strikes era when the war on drugs was really a big issue. It affected, my father was actually incarcerated for some time, went into work release, and actually moved out of state for fear of getting that 2nd and 3rd strike. Professionally, I volunteer at the Veterans Treatment Court down near Portland, Oregon. Also help with some of the crisis intervention team training with the local police down there to try to interdict or prevent people from entering the criminal justice system by identifying problems early. That's kind of my piece in this.
Okay, I'm gonna start with Jennifer. In thinking about the criminal justice system, what role do you think empathy plays, but also what would inspire an individual based upon all the many processes to go into criminal defense?
So we talked about this on a phone call, and empathy is one of the key things that ties all of us together, even as various as our positions are. And on the criminal defense side, for me, I think what really brings people into it is the human aspect and thinking about whatever the crime may be, that's still a father, a mother, a brother, a son, daughter, and kind of remembering that that person still deserves a chance and somebody to believe in them and help them along. And for me, that's a huge reason why I personally am really excited about the criminal defense side of it and remembering the human aspect.
Now I gotta kind of play devil's advocate because we don't want to stray too much to one side and forget about victimization and think about individuals who are victims of crime. So Pat, I would like to ask you to give me a twofold answer. One, about the perspective of prosecution, but also I would like you to tie in how philanthropy can play a role in reforming criminal justice system.
Yeah, so when I reflect back on my experience as a prosecutor, candidly, the first couple of years, I was just a baby snake. I had a ton of power and no idea how to wield it. I fell in line with the culture of my office, the success metrics that were set down. I mean, and then I was an Army officer, so I was thinking about supporting my commander and winning cases that were brought forward. Looking back now, I can see how naive, how ignorant I was in that approach. What was a really incredible opportunity about military service was I had the chance to move from working as a prosecutor to, in my next assignment, working as a defense counsel. And like Jen pointed out, that actually really helped me get to know the human side of nearly every single case that I was working on. It's challenging. As a prosecutor, a lot of my interactions were with the victims of crimes and very, very deep trauma that they felt. As a defense counsel, I realized the trauma on the other side. And it's hard to connect those dots. The system is set up also in a way that directly places those interests in direct opposition, and it's hard to truly maintain empathy with both sides. That, in part, to the last part of that question, is why I've decided to kind of step back and look at the system more holistically. In the space of philanthropy, we have that opportunity where we can fund initiatives that support community groups who are working on participatory defense initiatives. We can support programs that take into account victims' rights and ensure that they're paid appropriate attention to throughout all that process. And we can work with government agencies as well. So the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is partnering with government institutions as well through this data science initiative that I mentioned at the outset to really bring empathy into the space, to give people a more holistic view of the people affected by the criminal justice system.
I want to kind of like turn the corner and change it a little bit and ask Tom a question. There's a lot of sensationalism in America through the media, through social media, and it happens a lot when there's any type of conflict between police and community. In your opinion or from your perspective, what ingredients are missing from community and police engagement? What could you center or ground us around this public trust that's being misconstrued or tainted based on this sensationalism, what people see in the media?
Well, one of the things that was shocking for me in entering the academic world and studying criminology is how little we actually know about crime in the United States. We have something like 18,000 different police departments, and everyone has a different way of collecting information. But one of the things that we do know is, if we look over the last 400 years before the United States was even a nation, is that trust, there's a relationship between public trust and homicide rates. When people don't trust the government, don't trust the state to act in their interest and protect their interests and be fair arbiters, then more people die. People kill each other. And I think that in this day and age with social media, the way that human beings in our society communicate has changed in a fundamental way. I can't think of any change like this maybe since the creation of the printing press. And in that environment, we have huge segments of the population that are being bombarded with images and depictions of police-citizen encounters. And I worry that trust may be being eroded in such a way that it can't be regained. I think everyone here knows that it's once you lose trust, it's very difficult to get it back. So I think that's the major concern right now is these new ways of communicating are really undermining the ability for people to trust their government, to trust the state to act in their interests.
Wow. When you think about what's going on in America with this mass incarceration and how we incarcerate more people in America than any nation in the world, there are several things that we say that can combat this and combat recidivism. One of the things that often pops up is education. Scott, could you elaborate on the importance of education in combating criminogenic activity or recidivism?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really good question in terms of, why should we educate incarcerated individuals, right? Because I'm sure you guys are in college, probably paying a lot of money. Why should we give education away for free, especially higher education, right? And the number one thing I think if we could take away is that one, for every dollar that we spend on post-secondary education for incarcerated individuals, we save 4 or 5. So it's like physical sense, right? But also from a recidivism perspective, they are 43% less likely to go back into the system within 3 years. And from just like a human's perspective, it's just investing in people. I think that's a really important aspect of this. Regardless of what they did, understanding that you can be more than that and investing in that.
Okay. Eric, I want to ask you kind of like a different question because I want to ask you a question about individuals that are incarcerated and individuals that are leaving or returning to communities. One of the challenges as a person who has been incarcerated is that there is no transition from prison to the community that allows individual to actually deal with this traumatic experience they just went through. The expectation in society is once you release from prison, you're supposed to function as normal. What programs or what needs to be in place to prepare individuals mentally to return to society, and what, if necessary, needs to be in place once they leave prison to allow them to integrate back into society and be what we would call, and I don't even know if it's a real word, normal again.
Yeah, thanks, Chico. I know, so during my MSW studies, I worked with the National Alliance on Mental Illness down in the Portland, Oregon area. One of the things that we did was we worked with Clark County Corrections, where myself and some other counselors went in and we did some transition counseling with a lot of these people that are about to transition back into society. Once we open that conversation, you start learning a lot of things. And I think one of the things that jumped out at us is looking at the National Institute for Health, 61% of women who are incarcerated have some kind of mental health issue. And 44% of men, and this is at the federal level, have some kind of mental health issue. When you look at the state and the local, the numbers jump. It goes to about 3/4 of women and about a little over half of men have some kind of mental health issue. Now that could come in the form of something trauma-related. It could be an undiagnosed bipolar, depression, or some kind of anxiety disorder, which has kind of contributed to how they got there. So what we try to do is offer them an opportunity for wraparound services. And we were a nonprofit, so there really wasn't anything instituted at the state, the federal, or the local level, or even funded to kind of make those things happen. So really it was us sharing information with the hopes that they would come and see us, because there was no tie or no requirement for once released to continue with some kind of transition assistance. I was talking with Tom earlier. There's one of the other things we did. I think there's two ways to really address it is an interdiction before they even enter the system. And one of those things we did was we trained crisis intervention teams. And that was where some of the counselors would go out, we would give classes to the local law enforcement, and we would also bring people with us who had had previous experience with being arrested or having an interaction with the local law enforcement. And they had some kind of mental health diagnosis or illness that they were dealing with. And what they did is they shared their experience with the policeman, saying, I have autism. It is difficult for me to look you in the eye. That's something that I can't do. And when a policeman is not trained in CIT, they may interpret that much differently than what's really going on. Perhaps they have an aversion to being touched. Maybe they're in the middle of a psychotic episode or having a schizophrenic incident. When the police arrive, that's something very different if you don't have that mental health context. And one of the things in Washington they're doing, I'm hoping it takes a foothold, they're pushing it through state and local government, is coming up with an ID card. So if you have a mental health diagnosis, it's a bright colored card. Then when the police show up, you just raise that thing, and then they can kind of reassess how they're going to engage. But I think identifying some of those mental health concerns prior to even getting into the system, that would save so many families. It would save so many people the ability to work on what they need to, rather than going into a system that's going to just compound the trauma they've already endured.
Man, we've heard some great perspectives. Now I want to ask a more general question, and maybe one or two people can chime in. The first question I want to ask is, what role do you believe that race plays in the criminal justice system?
I think we'd be out of this world remiss if we don't talk about systemic racism and oppression in the criminal justice system. It's something, actually, just even in assembling this panel, that was immediately apparent to me that we actually didn't represent a huge community of people who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. But we also didn't, on our Tillman Scholar panel, have any initially anyone even from a community of color to participate in this panel. If you look historically at the role of police, one of the primary uses initially was in enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act. If you look at the legacy of racism in this country, You see the role that police and prosecutors played in the Jim Crow South and in enforcing segregationist policies in progressive communities in the North. And it's that type of institutionalized power dynamic that has led to the system where we are today. You can't ignore the foundation on which a system or an institution stands. And in this country, we have to acknowledge that the legacy of racism is the foundation on which our criminal justice system stands. That creates an enormous challenge for us as we think about criminal justice reform. In addition to the diversity on this panel, we have communities who do not trust the police, as Tom points out. We have communities who do not believe prosecutors are actors for good. We have communities who, across our nation, fear any interaction with the government or with law enforcement. And in large part, that's driven from the lens of racism. And that's a hard reality to acknowledge. I think for me personally, I have all of the sort of privileges that an American could experience. As a white, cisgendered, straight male, right? I walk into a room and I'm greeted in a certain way that reflects that history of racism in this country. And I think the criminal justice system is also on the front lines then of beginning to address those systemic disparities. It's a hard reality. It's an uncomfortable reality, but it's a reality that I think it's important we all acknowledge and come to grips with.
What language do you think we should use when looking at reform or potentially dismantling the criminal justice system? And I want to add this too, because some people have an abolitionist perspective, which just means let everything go and go free. What's practical? Because I think that's important, because I don't want to use so much idealism and it's something that's not practical. Someone like to chime in?
I think what you touched on, the history of especially policing in the United States, fugitive slaves, the enforcement of Jim Crow, putting down the civil rights movement, a lot of the drug laws, there's a tie to race as well. And with this lengthy history and this new lens being focused on policing, especially in the United States, I'm not sure that reform is the way to look at it. I think it's important to work on reform in the short term, but I think we need to be looking for bigger answers. I know I mentioned before the printing press, the creation of the printing press. I mentioned before this creation of the printing press and that the way we communicate now, the changes in the way we communicate, I find a lot of similarities. And if you look at what happened following the creation of the printing press, you have the 30 Years' War, you have the Reformation, you have revolutions, you have major systemic change. And in this environment, I feel as though it's important that we do something similar now. I would look to outsource with deindustrialization in the United States. We put more and more responsibility on the criminal justice system, mental health, drug enforcement, a lot of things that I really view as public health issues. And rather than trying to tweak the system and more effectively manage those types of issues, I think that we need to look to institutions that do have a greater degree of public trust. I'm not sure that the police can have the credibility to deal with those issues anymore. A great example we talked about with mental health issues. Right now, I'm helping to construct a database for people that have been killed by the police in the United States, going by case, reading accounts of the incident and trying to determine what the police were initially responding to, how they reacted, who was responsible, that sort of thing. And we don't have numbers yet, but one thing that really stands out to me is how many times someone in this country calls the police and says a loved one of theirs, a family member, a roommate, is in a crisis, that they're suicidal, and that they're worried and they're concerned and they want help. And as a society, we've determined over a long period of time that the best way to respond is to send armed, usually men, to deal with that police. And the people that they're dealing with oftentimes have a long history of dealing with that institution. And I think that we may want to consider shifting the focus to institutions that have greater degree of public trust, like the fire department, medical professionals, and sending police may not be the best way to deal with it. So I would urge that rather than simply trying to tweak the system, that we try to move the responsibilities that have been placed on policing to other venues, other institutions.
Can I add on to that, Chico? I think for me this needs a violent policy change. When you look at, so a study was done last year where they were looking at the rates of incarceration by state over a 10 or 15-year span. And they identified several states that, because of policy changes, had significant reductions in their total incarcerated population. I'm talking reductions between 14 and 25% of total population. And when you started looking at it, some of them would just really make sense. Why do we charge minors as adults? Like, why are we incarcerating minors with a crime that they're maybe not cognitively aware of what happened? So we're giving these mandatory minimum sentencing laws. They put people in prison for longer times than maybe is really necessary. Looking at the way that we do parole procedures, how long do you have to be in before you're eligible for parole? At what point, who do we have identifying that enough change has been made in terms of their behavior or their perspective that they'll step out and be capable? I think some of those are just really easy changes that can be made that would significantly reduce the population of people that are behind bars.
Yeah. Being in the military as opposed to in the civilian world creates this dichotomy. It's a similar dichotomy in the processes when we look at police accountability when police are suspected of committing a crime, and particularly if an individual is shot. How do you think we can best move to a place where police are yet held more accountable and information of actually what took place is more accessible to the public?
One of the things I mentioned before is that we have 18,000 police departments in the United States, approximately. And each one of those institutions, they have in different states, there are different rules, different procedures, different laws regarding the sharing of information. And I feel as though some type of nationalization of police may be in order, where we have some standardization, so that if I live on the south side of Chicago, I have the same level of service and oversight that I might have in a wealthy suburb in, say, Oak Park or some other neighborhood. That would be my best advice.
So I think this is an interesting issue that also highlights the age we live in, where we have kind of the dual purposes or the double-edged sword of data and what it can do. So we read in the space around criminal justice some of the harm that data science can perpetuate if either biased data or biased decision makers are just kind of encoded into the algorithms that are then used for decision making. We see that specifically with either predictive policing, which leads to over-policing of the same areas over and over again. We see that with algorithmic release recommendations in bail, where if we're looking at the number of times someone has had an encounter in law enforcement as being determinative of whether we're going to release them because we think arrest is correlated with danger, we see a lot of that perpetuating. But we also see opportunities here. And so with better data science approaches, we're bringing more of this information together, I think we'll have a better handle on where incidences are occurring on the policing side. To some of your work around police community interactions and police-involved killings. We are also specifically working on this in the world of prosecutors. And so the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is working with DA's offices to help them get a better handle on their data so they can inform their decision making. So this, I think, really shows the intersection of maybe a variety of other pursuits with this criminal justice space as well.
Before we transition into audience questions, I want to ask you a question, Jen. If you were to propose legislation, what do you think would be a first step to transforming the criminal justice system? What would be like a nice first step?
It's not an easy question.
This is your third year law school exam question. Ready, go.
Do I have to create this? So I have not spent as much time as these folks have on the criminal justice system in the US, but I do think that it's pretty obvious that sentencing minimums is a huge issue, so addressing that is one step I would consider. I also think looking at the way the sentencing process works, say for example, and please correct me if I'm wrong, those that are convicted of murder are going to trial and being convicted and then sentenced after that, having a sentencing trial after the conviction. And so I think separating that two changes the way a jury would look at a crime. If you are not given those instructions on how to sentence until after the conviction happens, I think you're stuck in that minimum of what you're supposed to give. So I think even looking at the way the trials are set up and trying to put those together would be one fairly simple way of fixing some of that.
I want to ask, it's one question that I think everybody needs to answer, and we could be real quick with it. The advantage that everyone on this panel has is that they have experience in the military, but also in civilian life because, okay, we start off as civilians and then we transition into the military. What processes or protocols in the military do you think should be adopted in civilian life that would make it more effective and efficient? What could you take that we utilize in the military and you say, hey, if we only had this in the civilian court system, it'll make it function better? And you speak from each of your lenses and say, this is something in the military that needs to be in civilian life.
I'm happy to cut in line if you want. Yeah.
Well, if you've read my bio, I haven't had the best military experience. But I would say that in terms of dealing with sexual violence, we have tried addressing this in the military by separating who is reviewing those charges or accusations of sexual violence. And so I think one thing that needs to happen is trying to figure out how to separate the prosecution from looking like just the government, as opposed to, I guess, looking at prosecution and the judge as the same team. I think that happens for a lot of defendants, that you feel like you're just, the judge is on the prosecution side. I mean, it feels that way from a defense side. And so I think figuring out a way of truly having a neutral party in looking at some of these situations, and even in looking at law enforcement and how folks are charged for crimes that they're committing as officers, having that neutral party is a really big step. But I mean, even in the military, we're struggling with that.
Yeah, the military struggles with this as well, but I think they're working on this. And the issue I would hold up to civilians as an example to strongly consider the way the military is approaching is in how we're working with victims and survivors of crime. There's been a lot of attention, appropriately so, on sexual violence in the military. And a reform that was instituted a few years back is to mandate free legal counsel to victims and survivors of crime. I think that is still in its infancy, but as a way of truly supporting people through the re-traumatization of the criminal justice system after an already traumatic event, I think thinking about how we provide support to victims and survivors is critical. I think it's critical to the reform efforts because the easy counterpoint to saying decarcerate is, but what about these victims? And so we have to make sure that we are mindful of the people on both sides of the criminal justice system who are directly impacted as we're thinking through reform.
I'm not sure that looking to the military is necessarily the best place to be looking. When I look at the criminal justice system, especially law enforcement, policing, I don't really see I see them as being part of the same larger institution. There's a connection between the military and law enforcement in the United States down to the people that are actually working. When I was an officer in Phoenix, the people I was alongside of were in reserve units, National Guard units. They were going to Iraq, going to Afghanistan, coming back, policing, going back to Iraq, Afghanistan, engaging in war. And culture is transmitted between institutions through people. And I think that we already have a highly militarized police in the United States. And I think that maybe less of a reliance on military tactics and ways of thinking is the way to go, more so than looking for solutions there.
Yeah, and for me, because in education, I'm not really looking to the military, other than the fact that, like, initially I enlisted in the Army back in 2000 so that I could go to college. And I think that's a big part why today I'm really interested in, increasing access and equity within higher education. And so that's kind of how I got interested in this position right now. Just think about, like, who gets to go and, like, why. There's a lot of things that are going on. We've talked about race. We haven't really brought up class yet, but I think that's an important, like, identity dimension. And so really just offering up higher education, not just as like recidivism or something like that, like, kind of like a numbers issue, although I do think those are important, but just like as a basic human, like, good type thing.
So I've been in the Army longer than I haven't been, so I'm not sure if I'm an authority on how to be a civilian. Civilians kind of freak me out sometimes. So one of the things, though, that I think maybe that transfers well, and I think as a group we can understand this, is in the Army there's that sense of community and a sense of belonging and being a part of something else. In the Veterans Treatment Court, that's one of those things that I think is really an enabler to help people overcome some of their issues. In the Veterans Treatment Court, if you're not familiar with it, a soldier or a former soldier or a current soldier may have committed a crime, and by virtue of their service, they can get diverted to a treatment court, which focuses more on rehabilitation or some kind of therapeutic resolve rather than being incarcerated. And what I found, my experience has been, when you have that common brotherhood or sisterhood of service, whether they've done something wrong or right post-military service, they still have that same work ethic and they need that support community. And oftentimes that's what drives them into bad situations, that they've left that community of support. And I think that's something that we can take over to some of those therapeutic court systems, in particular the Veterans Court. And there's just not enough of them. There's like 3,000 counties in the US. Only 500 of them have a Veterans Treatment Court. And of those, if you're in a rural area, or if you are, there's not a lot of interagency help with this, or inter-county help. If you're charged with a crime in one county, they may not release jurisdiction to the other. I think it's one thing that we could really help by reaching out to our constituents, or our representatives rather, and ask them to kind of, hey, let's make these barriers, kind of eliminate some of these barriers and offer them access to that option.
Great. Right now, I'd like to transition and go to some of the audience questions to answer some of the things that the audience was inquisitive about.
All right, we're going to use the Slido app, by the way.
Yeah,
So
let me stand up so I'll be able to see it. Anonymous, of course. When you consider your different perspectives on the problems, where are some areas where your respective work can intersect in a practical way?
Yeah, so I think, like, working in higher education, but also, it's not just that this is not a cure for recidivism, or this is, because again, just like in college, not everyone, one, has the desire to go, two, can succeed in that environment. But I think, working in partnership with, like, counselors, mental health, education, but then also with, as individuals go through these programs, I think reduced sentences is a big part of that. Time cuts, in other words. And so that's working with lawyers, case managers, things like that.
Scott, does your program have any plans also to offer degrees to incarcerated women?
Oh, okay. So, like the Moreau College Initiative, we're part of the Bard Prison Initiative, like it's a consortium. So there are options for incarcerated women within Bard. We, in Indiana, service, we're just at a men's prison, and it's separated by gender. So for us, and it, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Indiana, but Notre Dame and Holy Cross, they're kind of right at the top of the state, right up by Michigan, and the women's prison is way south. So it's actually just a distance issue. Like, we cannot convince tenure professors to be making that 3-hour drive. Just, yeah.
Okay, here's a great question. Do you think that the presence of armed law enforcement on grade school campuses is beneficial or detrimental to repairing trust issues?
Can I jump in on that one? So I have a pretty personal experience with this. I don't know if Eric is familiar, but I actually had a friend that was recently killed in Eugene and happened to have a weapon on him on a grade school campus. He wasn't there to necessarily cause harm to the students, I assume, but got into an altercation with law enforcement and ended up pulling out his weapon right outside of the campus. And I do think it is detrimental in some ways, and I also can see how it's necessary. But I think a big part of it is training for law enforcement officers and being able to take down someone that's armed without necessarily having to go to the point of pulling out another weapon and potentially endangering more lives. And in this particular case, although this person did take out a weapon and shot at the officer, what was really helping get him down was somebody else was there as backup, and they were really well trained in being able to subdue him before reaching for a weapon.
I could chime in real quick. I think that I love going to the range. I've spent thousands of hours at the range. I love shooting, but I think we have a gun problem in the United States. I know it's an uncomfortable thing to say. I know when I was a police officer in Phoenix, every time I pulled over a vehicle, I just assumed there was a firearm in the car. On a daily basis, I encountered weapons. And then when I interact with law enforcement from other countries, I have some Canadian friends that are officers, and they'll work in a mid-sized Canadian city and go years without seeing a firearm. And when people get upset and they want to hurt somebody, they pull out a knife, they punch somebody, whereas in the United States, we shoot each other. So I know it's uncomfortable. It's part of our social fabric in this country and our history. And again, I love firearms as well, but we have a real problem. And I think for your friend, asking police officers to deal with people with firearms, people are pointing weapons at them, and not shoot, may be too big of an ask, for people. And it may be more reasonable to say that we need to address the fact that we are just inundated, swamped with weapons in this country.
Any thoughts on the role of private prisons in worsening recidivism, especially given the perverse incentive to maximize incarceration for profit?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's a bad idea. I mean, that's a personal statement. Because when you're bringing capitalism into incarceration, those two things, I don't think they should be paired. And when we think about, I think it needs to be what is a social good, and going from that aspect. But.
Yeah, I actually love this particular question because for me, it's a red herring. Private prisons, I think, house, let's call it, it's under 10% of the in-prison population in the United States. So it's a very small percentage. Private prisons in their own right, I actually don't think are bad. There's a government counterparty that is not holding a government contractor accountable for results. The creation of the private prison industry was an abdication of government responsibility that's perpetuated by a failure of oversight and a failure to actually do your job. If you want to think about structural impediments to to decarceration, so some of the structural causes of incarceration, of mass incarceration, a better place to look is at our local elected leaders, and actually the institutional power of, for example, organized labor that represents corrections officers, or the police organizations, or the district attorneys associations. These are really, really powerful political institutions that have strong incentives to resist reform and specifically to resist decarceration. So I think it's more, I mean, honestly, the private prison rhetoric to me feels more like demagoguery and emotional appeals than it feels like practical policy. And what I would like us to move toward is a system where government actually does their job and holds the rest of the system accountable to do their jobs as well.
Okay, well, considering that, what part do private for-profit prisons who pay big money lobbyists to keep prisons full and expanding play, and are we considering this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to my prior point, I just sort of disagree with the premise. I think that we've gotten carried away with rhetoric on that particular issue, and I don't know that it accurately reflects reality. And we can actually look at the presence of private prisons abroad and the effectiveness of those. So there's a pay-for-performance prison system in the UK, in Peterborough, England. They actually have a prison that receives compensation for the government for outcomes, for reduced recidivism, for the goals of rehabilitation. I mean, and it's crazy to tie together an expectation of outcomes when you're paying someone for a service, but somehow they managed to crack that in the UK. They also have incredibly well-functioning private prisons in Australia and New Zealand. They're a great example. They don't do everything right. Candidly, it's super hard work working in a prison. It's not an easy job. There's also a lack of empathy that we experience, not just with the people being held in prison, but with the people we ask to sort of serve in a policing function within prisons, the corrections officers themselves. That's you couldn't pay me enough money to be a corrections officer, candidly, right? So just disagree with the premise and would love to chat with anyone separately about that.
I agree with much of what you said, but I would push back with that rhetoric is important. So when a huge number of our people in our society view these public prisons as immoral and unjust, and society as a whole is coming to the conclusion that we don't want a profit motive in our prison systems, that we want that to be a strictly government function. I would agree with them. I think that if it's sending a message to the population, even if it's not, doesn't bear itself out in the data, the fact that people feel that way about private prisons, I think is enough for me to say, yeah, let's keep it as a government function and not introduce the profit motive into incarceration. That said, the data, I agree with you in your with the numbers.
Another thing, people convicted of felonies often can't access public housing, receive federal aid, and other things that people who haven't been incarcerated may be able to receive. As a society, how can we remove some of these barriers to help individuals not recidivate and be more successful?
One of the great things that we're actually a part of at Notre Dame and Holy Cross is we participate in Second Chance Pell as a test site, as a pilot site. And that legislation is coming up for review again. And what Second Chance Pell is that it provides federal funding for incarcerated individuals to access those funds to pursue higher education. And I think that's really, really important in terms of like looking at second chances, obviously with Second Chance Pell, but also just in terms of like, taking down some of these barriers. Because again, when you look at from an intersectional perspective, many of the individuals who are currently incarcerated also are low SES. So like had they even had the opportunity to pursue higher education. And getting out then as a felon, how are they going to be able to even do that? So I really think taking down some of those barriers and opening doors where individuals can access these programs that can then change their lives, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, and I love that question was submitted by Mike. Mike's my good friend who I invited to come out to this conference to try. Oh, sorry, different Mike Nelson? Oh, dang it. Well, I'm going to take this time actually to soapbox for my other friend, Mike Nelson, then. So what can we do as a society to think about these barriers? Candidly, it's get to know people who are coming out of prison. Realize that in this country, 9 million people leave jail every single year. 400,000 leave prison. Right? 95% of those incarcerated are coming back to our communities. These are our neighbors and hopefully soon our friends. There's a space to actually get to know folks, to create this empathy that we started this conversation with, to have some sort of conversation and just appreciate the humanity of a people that we've largely as a society decided to discard. It's just fundamentally immoral, it's wrong, and I would hope that we as a community, the Tillman Scholar community, can lead the charge in bringing empathy back into this space. So like I mentioned, my good friend, other Mike Nelson, I'm going to go with Mike Nelson number one because I knew that Mike Nelson first. So that Mike Nelson, I would encourage you just throughout the rest of this weekend, find a chance to have a conversation with Mike, hear his story. You'll find it, I think, as impactful as I found it personally and as inspirational to continue the work in this space as I found it.
What were the rates of incarceration before and after the mass closure of public mental health hospitals?
Yeah, that's a Google question.
Okay, so, so I know, I think I kind of know where this is going. So back, I know in the 60s, they kind of had a mass closure of a lot of our mental health institutions, and I kind of touched on it earlier. What that's done is that's kind of turned it back over to the families, letting people say, hey, we're going to take care of these things at home. You can take care of your sick brother or sister, daughter or mother. And the reality is, in a working class family, you just don't have that kind of time, and so that kind of gets pushed to the side. With this issue, it's just kind of, it's turned the prison system into kind of a de facto mental health institution full of people who aren't capable or don't have the training to care for the people that need it. So when you have such a high percentage of the population and incarcerated that has some kind of mental health issue, how are we really fixing the problem? But we're just compounding it more. So it's no surprise when there is a release that there's recidivism. I think that kind of gets at it. Like in Washington State, we had 122 inpatient beds as of a couple years ago. I think they're adding 80 more. But in a state, only 200 beds. I don't know what the expectation is. Like, how are you taking care of the population? Where are they going to go on that night that they're having that psychic break or psychiatric break or this schizophrenic episode? They're going to go to prison or they're going to go to jail overnight, and then they're not going to get treatment there either. So I think that loss of the healthcare system really amplified the prison's role in this.
You mentioned the lack of diverse representation on the panel itself. What implications does representation or lack thereof have on perception of the system?
This is something I struggle with, right? So in the Army, talking with a bunch of soldiers, being that white guy up in front of the crowd, telling them how to be soldiers, that's one thing. Being a social worker, trying to interact with a population that doesn't look like me often is a challenge. Fortunately, my wife was a woman of color, and we have a very blended family, and she knocks me off my privilege pedestal daily. Often when I don't even realize that I'm about to stand on top of it. I think for me, what I have to understand is that I haven't walked in your shoes. I don't have that experiential knowledge. It's not something that I may be able to empathize with on that emotional level. I've seen it happen to my children. I've seen it happen to my spouse. But what I can be is by virtue of my positional power, by virtue of my rank or whatever position I may have, it's not my job to speak for you, but I can amplify your voice. And that's kind of the role that I've taken on. I try to share that with people when they do come to me with some kind of concerns, because how does this white guy from Southern California understand the problems of my spouse grew up in Southern Illinois in Section 8 housing. So how do we really relate to those things? But I can be a power projection. I think that's how I would engage.
You mentioned something earlier about kind of comparisons to the military. It would be an interesting panel if we had a panel on military service and we didn't have any military members on the panel, right? Unfortunately, the panel that we have, with the exception of our wonderful guest Chico, does not have the experience of actually going through this system, and I think it really does impact the depth of the solutions that we'll find in the space, and it's critical that we do reach out and amplify the people who are directly system impacted to understand their perspectives and help support their vision of the remade justice system.
If I could just add too, and I think it's not just having the experience of being incarcerated, but also having the experience of living and growing up in the environment that incarcerated person has grown up in. When you have folks that are coming from really wealthy backgrounds because they're the ones that can afford to go to law school and they're defending you, it is hard for the defendants to feel like they can relate or that you understand them or that they can trust you. And so I think trying to find your own ability to create some cultural competency in their own upbringings is a really important way of reaching defendants, even if you haven't been incarcerated, or empowering those. I mean, hopefully one day I can give enough money for somebody else like me to go to a law school, and providing programs that put people like us that are from different backgrounds in our defense and even prosecution side.
I got a question, and then we're going to return there. When you consider the perpetual traumatization in certain communities, and then some of those individuals commit a criminal act, and then they go through dehumanization by going through this incarceration process, how do you bring them back to a mental space of normalcy?
Okay, can you shorten that again?
Okay. Many individuals have socioeconomic factors in these particular communities, whether it's racism, disinvestment in the communities, poverty, and then they go from this space into a prison system where they're being strip searched, where they're locked down 23 hours. How do you bring them back to a space to operate as what we would consider humane?
I think it takes an entire community, and probably everyone on this panel, every field would play a major part. So not just the community that they're coming back to, being able to accept them and have empathy for what they've gone through or where they're coming from, but also providing educational opportunities for them, and a support system too on the social work side that allows them to grow. So I think it's really important that all of our fields are empowered in order to bring them back.
One word that we used a lot when I was in law enforcement was, oh, he's institutionalized. Like, that guy's been institutionalized. And I think that there's a point when you dehumanize a person enough, and that it may become impossible for them to reintegrate into society. So my advice would be maybe we should stop doing those things to people. Would probably be a good start, and to recognize that we all have the same goal, where we're trying to control a population. We're trying to exert influence over human beings and shape their behavior so that they don't engage in things that we've decided are deviant activities. And to be pragmatic and say, well, what is effective? What does the science tell us is an effective way to change human behavior? And locking someone in a cage for 23 hours a day is not an effective way to change behavior.
Okay, Jennifer, can you speak to the role of the defense side of the criminal justice equation and how important the process to achieving justice?
So on the defense side, I think, at least with my experience on a defense team, it's really important to understand your defendant and what they've gone through from essentially from their upbringing to the time of the crime. And being able to have a team that really understands all of that is really crucial to being able to support that individual. I also think that what's really important about the defense side, some people might ask, how can you defend those people? How can you defend that murderer, that rapist? And I think one way that folks interested or on the fence about going on the defense side is to consider not how can I defend that person, but how can I defend our justice system? How can you stand up for that person to, at the very least, ensure that he's getting or she's getting a fair trial and a fair process where, that you're supporting them in the best way that you can and providing the best legal defense that they can afford.
I got a kind of different question, and maybe you can chime in as to in that similar vein. How do you feel about representing someone that you know is guilty, that the information is clear cut, but you have an obligation as a defense attorney to try to get them exonerated? How do you feel in situations where you're looking at the evidence and they may be guilty, but maybe a technicality might be in place to allow them to be exonerated? Pat, I'd like for you to chime in too, because you spent some time as both a prosecutor and as a public defender.
Would a technicality include things like torture?
No, I'm saying technicality such as Miranda rights,
Yeah.
or something was left out where some type of processes or protocol that would allow them to be exonerated, even though looking at the evidence, that they actually did whatever the state or the prosecutor said they are accusing them of.
I think we as lawyers have a little bit of a sadistic humor because it's a coping mechanism. So when we make off-color jokes, yeah, a lot of times it's just us trying to put in place, where these things come in our minds.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what I just said too, is it's even if you do feel like this person did commit it or they have admitted it to you, a big part of your job on the defense side is to ensure that the process is a fair process and giving them as competent legal defense as you possibly can. If there are issues within the system that have been flawed, if there is something like torture involved, these are things that you do want to address as the defense side, because you want to make the community and the rest of our country aware of what's happening and highlight those things, not only for your defendant, but so that we aren't making these same mistakes over and over again. So I do think that a big part of this is being an advocate for the system itself and ensuring that we are upholding the rights that we've committed to giving everyone.
The system is naturally in tension. It's an adversarial system. I think it's in some ways been corrupted and distorted over its evolution, but that's a natural tension of the obligations of someone who's a defense counsel. There are ethical guidelines, right? I can't put my client up on the stand knowing that my client will lie. So there is some guidance there. That's sort of an outer limit. But then, for me personally, I processed it with a sense of emotional detachment to the extent that I could do that. Honestly, that became too hard for me over time. I dealt with primarily sexual assault cases when I was in the military. And, eventually I realized I could not be the type of partner and father I wanted to be while I was trying to hold these other things in tension that were otherwise just very, very difficult. So I think it's just hard work. You're reconciling, like a lot of what we do in life, you're reconciling things that they're not easily reconcilable. That being said, I've had cases where I've gotten really caught up in the tactics of the case, cases where I'm really proud of my defense work. Where we poured through hundreds of hours of prison telephone calls and caught co-conspirators lying about the client I represented, there's some professional satisfaction in doing your job well, and I think that played a role for me.
Language about re-entering society implies the experience of incarceration is something outside of society. What are the implications?
Well, I mean, just to hop in real quick. I mean, I don't know, by show of hands, how many of y'all have been to like a prison? Honestly, that's surprising. And I mean, I've seen y'all drink, so maybe not. But that's great. And I think there is a real disconnect from, what we consider outside society and incarcerated institutions. And so there's not usually, people going and meeting or seeing those folks. So I do think there's like, there's physical boundaries, obviously fences and walls and stuff like that. But there's really just like an experience, like boundary that usually just doesn't get crossed. So when we talk about being removed from society, some of the individuals that I work with, students have been incarcerated since they were teenagers. And now many of them are older than I am, and they're about to get out because, in order for to be in our program, they have to be within 10 years of being released. And, they've never seen an iPhone. Well, I mean, they've seen it with the guards and stuff. But, I mean, they've never used one. So there's really just being removed from everything that we're interacting with. So that reentry, I think, it almost needs to be scaffolded. And, like, how can we scaffold that to decrease shock almost?
When I hear that question, that sort of gets to the heart of kind of not having the lived experience. The best way I can try to connect is conversations and reading. And we can talk about book recommendations at some point, but there's one in particular I'd highlight. It's a book by a man named Shaka Senghor, and it's called Righting My Wrongs, and it's his memoir of life in prison. He was sentenced to, I think, 45 years. I think he ended up serving 19, but 7 of those were in solitary confinement. And just think about spending 7 years of your life in solitary. He talks a lot about the experience that he had in prison of taping phone books and other things from the prison library to his stomach and chest because he was very worried in particular instances about being stabbed. That's a different world. I don't call that society. I do very much categorize that as something other than, and re-entering and returning is an incredibly difficult thing that we do that we do not help people through in any form or fashion. We make it, in fact, much harder, as the person asked earlier about access to benefits and housing and things along those lines.
We're going to take a couple more questions and then we're going to wrap it up. How critical is it for police organizations to show accountability and hold cops responsible for cases of brutality, profiling, and corruption?
I have a feeling I'm going to have to answer this one. It's important. The short answer.
How critical? How critical?
Very.
On a scale of critical
Very
to
critical.
Yeah, all right.
Like I said before, if we look at the United States before it became a country, the last 400 years, and a key indicator for whether or not people are going to kill each other is do they trust the government? Do they trust the people in power to protect their interests and be fair arbiters? And when you have an incident where someone acts in an unlawful way and they're not held accountable, it undermines public trust, and that's a public safety issue, and people die as a result. So it's vital.
Jennifer, do you feel the panel is indicative of the justice system?
I saw that question on here. What's interesting is so a lot more women are entering law school. I think Georgetown has admitted over 50% of women for at least the last couple years. And so I do think it's changing, but it is interesting to see that the amount of experience that my male counterparts have here, it is indicative of what we see right now. There are a lot of women entering the legal field, but we just haven't reached some of the bigger positions or just haven't had a lot of time in our roles just yet. But I do think it's getting better. I mean, my class in school is an extraordinarily large number of women, and not just white women, but women of color. And so I think it is changing. But I don't know. I can't speak to the side of law enforcement.
Yeah, it's a challenge in law enforcement. One of the things I'm concerned about right now is with what's happening in society at large, what type of individuals are going to be drawn to law enforcement. That's a major concern of mine.
I think when we had these type of conversations, the most important part of it is not just for audience engagement, but some type of call to action, because it would be disheartening if we have these type of conversations and we don't leave with some type of call to action, because typically most people are wondering, what can I do or how can I impact these things that I heard today. So now, in closing, I would like each person on the panel to give the audience something you feel they can do to help create this climate for change in criminal justice reform. We'll start with you, Jennifer, and we'll go down the line.
Sure. So I think I actually have 2 points. So one is kind of what I've already said, and I'll just reiterate. If you are considering going on the defense side and you're looking at the legal field or don't know how to understand it, I'd say to not look at, if you can't find empathy for the defendant, find empathy for the system then, and recognize that we do need capable people representing our system and our Constitution and being able to defend on that aspect. For the work that I've been doing, I will say that one really important thing that is missing from our society is knowledge of what's going on at military commissions. We have detainees that have been there for 16 years without a trial. And if it does go to trial, there's a chance that they could come to the United States and be tried in our courts. And I think one really important thing that everyone can do is just make themselves aware of what's going on at Guantanamo. So even following military commissions, I believe it's militarycommissions.org, you can read transcripts and see what's going on in those courts, but stay abreast of our justice system, and not just here, but what's happening at Guantanamo too.
So in the criminal justice reform space, I think the most critical actor to influence are the prosecutors. I think the prosecutors have, by far and away, the most power in the system, and therefore the prosecutors are really the most responsible for mass incarceration and are the key to decarceration. The vast majority of district attorneys in the United States are elected officials, but the election turnouts for DA races are sad. I think I read this recently in Queens. They had a critical DA primary, and there were 2.2 million people registered to vote in Queens in this particular election, and 90,000 people showed up to vote, and the race is down to 16 votes. Oftentimes, when we're participating in democracy and democratic processes and electing our government officials, we're unsure whether we can actually make an impact. I would offer that in a DA's race and in the context of criminal justice reform, your vote matters. You can hold your district attorney accountable to decarcerative policies, and I would just encourage you to get involved in those races, especially in the upcoming election cycle.
Well, I'd like to revise something I said earlier when I said that maybe we shouldn't be looking to the military for solutions, but I think that there is something we can learn, and that is that when you're in a position of power and you're responsible for other human beings, that there's a responsibility that comes with that. The things that we say matter, especially when we're in a position of power, and with some of the things that have been happening lately, I'm really concerned that the rhetoric that's being used is going to irreparably undermine the public trust. When we tell people to go back to their country, when we call places shitholes and say that people are rapists and murderers and a few good people. Regardless of what your political opinions are, we need to recognize that that has an impact on how people view the state. And when people hear that, they lose trust. They're less willing to call the police. They're less willing to act as a witness, to give an accurate account when they get pulled over, how they're going to interact with law enforcement. And in the future, in years to come, I'm pretty sure that people are going to look back and look at the numbers and see that people have died as a result of the rhetoric that is currently being used. So I would urge everyone to demand that people in power in this country use their words responsibly and recognize that what they say and how they treat people has an impact on people's lives, and people can die as a result.
Yeah. So for me, my call to action would be, one, I think Second Chance Pell. I mean, if wherever you feel, and you can talk to me afterwards, I think it's a great opportunity for these individuals. And then two would be try to engage. You guys are at institutions of higher education. There are many different types of programs, like inside-out programs, or just programs servicing individuals in jails, prisons, maybe even federal institutions. And become a part of it. Volunteer. Connect with those individuals. And I think just having those human connections can be transformative.
So I never knew what imposter syndrome was until the other day, and I always had those feelings. But after yesterday and today, it's like amplified. So thank you for teaching me about that. But one thing that I've gained out of that is the spheres of influence in this room are amazing. The channels that you have and the paths that you take are so diverse. We have the ability to reach out and affect people that are so different from the areas that we work in. One thing that I look at as the community aspect of it is, what can you do in your local community? Like, what can we do that's an immediate impact? And the one thing that's important to me, and the one thing that I've shared, and the one thing I hope you would take away from today is they do have that crisis intervention team training. And if you can contact your local leaders and ask them if your police force is trained in those things, do they respond to crises? When there's an identified mental health crisis, is it a trained CIT officer arriving, or is it not? And I think using those things can really kind of mitigate some of these problems we're having in the justice system. But that's something we can affect at the lowest and the local level, regardless of our lines of effort. But, yeah.
Chico, what's your call to action for us? Final word.
I believe everybody has a platform, and I believe it's critical that we use our voice for the better good, to make sure things are right. All of us have a moral compass, and we know when things aren't right and when things are, and use your voice for people that are voiceless. I think that's critical. Everyone in here took a vow of service, and I don't want the service to end once you leave the formal military service. Allow your voice to continue to be heard.
Thank you. And to each of our panelists, Chico, thank you all. Thank you all very, very much. The great intellectual historian Carl Becker said that the duty of a scholar is to think otherwise, and I think we had a wonderful combination, be it either the human concern of communities, right, the inherent good of education, trust, right, this notion of informed electoral participation, and again, this notion of empathy within the system of due process, while all making our voices heard. So again, thank you for sharing your voices. Again, on behalf of the foundation, thank you all for joining us. But more importantly, thank you for the stuff and the action that you're out there doing in each of those realms as well. So again, another round of applause for a great panel.
Thank you.
You're welcome.